It begins with the disturbing possibility that history never prepared us to face. What if humanity was never meant to succeed on its own? What if our earliest gods were not symbols, but beings of flesh and intent who arrived, worked, and then left? Why do the oldest civilizations speak not of creation through love, but through labor? Why does gold appear obsessively in the first myths, long before it had practical value? Why do stories of sudden abandonment echo across cultures that never met? Why do our origins feel less like a birth and more like an experiment abruptly paused? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. The land between the rivers did not begin as a kingdom of dust and ruin. Long before stone temples cut shadows into the sun, before kings carved their names into clay, this place breathed. The Tigris and the Euphrates moved like twin serpents through a vast green plain, swelling and retreating with a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost measured. Reeds whispered in the warm wind. Dark silt clung to bare feet. At night, the sky unfolded without restraint, stars packed so tightly together that the heavens seemed close enough to touch, as if the ceiling of the world had been lowered on purpose. Here, memory was not written yet. It lived in voices, in gestures, in fear passed from parent to child. And beneath those memories lay something older than fear itself, the sense that the world had been interrupted. Clay tablets would come later, cities would rise later. But first there was arrival. The stories insist it was not subtle. The sky did not politely open. It tore. Fire descended with thunder that did not belong to storms, a sound so violent it drove animals mad and sent early humans scrambling into marshes and caves. What fell was not stone, not lightning, not anything nature had prepared them to understand. It was metal that burned, objects that roared, shapes that moved against gravity itself. The ground shook as if the planet recoiled. From the perspective of those who watched, these were not visitors. They were endings. Figures emerged from the descending craft, tall and deliberate, their movements controlled, efficient, stripped of hesitation. They wore skins that reflected light like wet fish scales, not armor in the human sense, but something sealed, functional, alive with unfamiliar purpose. Their faces were hidden behind smooth enclosures that glinted beneath the sun. Whether they struggled to breathe or found the air perfect, the observers could not know. All they knew was that the beings walked upright with confidence, as if the land already belonged to them. Later generations would call them the Anunnaki, a word that breaks apart cleanly in the old language. An, meaning sky, Kai, meaning earth, and the space between them implying movement, descent, intention. Those who came from the sky to the ground, not spirits, not metaphors, travelers. They did not arrive seeking worship. They arrived with urgency. Their world, according to the tablets written thousands of years later, was failing, not in a dramatic explosion, but in a slow, relentless decay. Imagine a planet stretched thin by an enormous orbit, spending most of its existence far from warmth, wrapped in darkness so cold it gnawed at the atmosphere itself. When it finally swung close to its star, the heat came violently and briefly, like a fever that never cured the disease. Life there survived only through mastery of science, so advanced it collapsed into something indistinguishable from magic. But even mastery has limits. The Anunnaki faced atmospheric erosion, the gradual peeling away of the shield that kept their world alive. Their solution was not spiritual, it was material. They needed a metal capable of conducting energy, reflecting radiation, and dispersing heat when reduced to microscopic particles. Gold, not as ornament, not as currency, but as survival technology, a planetary medicine. Their instruments scanned the solar system, searching not for beauty, but for abundance. Earth answered. This planet was young, loud, unstable, and rich. Gold ran through its crust like veins beneath skin, locked in stone, scattered in riverbeds, suspended even in seawater itself. For a civilization on the edge of extinction, it was not a miracle. It was a resource. The first base was established where water and land met, a region later remembered as Eridu, the distant home. It was not a city in the human sense, but an operational node, a place where machines interfaced with a living planet. From there, the work began: extraction, refinement, transport. For a time, the system functioned, but the Anunnaki did not work alone. Within their hierarchy existed a labor class, the Igigi, beings of the same origin but lower rank, tasked with physical execution rather than command. They were sent into the deep places, into the burning sun of southern lands, into mines carved from stone that resisted every tool. They worked cycles that lasted centuries, under conditions that broke even advanced bodies. Gold dust filled lungs, heat warped judgment. The reward was survival of a distant planet they would never see again. Resentment grew slowly, then all at once. When the Igigi finally revolted, it wasn't a symbolic protest. They laid down tools, surrounded command centers, and made the threat real. No more gold, no more labor, no more salvation for the home world. The crisis that followed was not moral. It was logistical. The leaders gathered. Enlil, commander and administrator, viewed the rebellion as failure of discipline. His solution was punishment. Enki, scientist and engineer, saw something else, a system strained beyond sustainability. You could not whip reality into compliance forever. The mines needed workers. The workers needed replacement. Enki looked not to the stars, but to the ground beneath their feet. The planet was already populated, not by humans as we know them, but by earlier versions of us. Hominins adapted to Earth's rhythms, strong, resilient, limited. They hunted. They endured. They did not question. Their minds were present but unexpanded, like unlit rooms. Enki's proposal was simple and monstrous in its elegance. Do not create life from nothing. Modify what already exists. Blend essence. Accelerate development. Build a being capable of understanding commands, using tools, and enduring labor, but constrained enough to remain controllable. A worker species. The council resisted. To alter life at that level crossed boundaries even they feared. But fear loses power when extinction waits on the other side of inaction. The decision was made. In a place called the House of Life, where air hummed and fluids glowed faintly under controlled light, the experiment began. Genetic material was not mixed like paint. It was edited, cut, rearranged with precision that sliced reality itself. Early attempts failed. Forms emerged incomplete, unstable, unable to survive outside artificial support. Each failure was erased, reduced back to raw material. Pressure mounted, time mattered. Eventually, success arrived quietly. A being opened its eyes and did not die. It breathed, it responded, its body held symmetry, its mind held potential. They called it Adamu, meaning simply, the one of the earth. Humanity did not begin as a myth. It began as a solution. At first, the design included a final safeguard: sterility. The new beings would work, but they would not multiply. Control would remain absolute, and for a while, it did. The gold flowed again. Ships rose into the sky, carrying powdered salvation back toward a dying world. But something had gone wrong. Enki watched his creation move, learn, react. He saw pain register. He saw recognition flicker behind unfamiliar eyes. He had not built a tool. He had built awareness, and awareness does not stay quiet. The experiment had solved one problem while planting another. A species designed to obey had inherited the spark to question. The Anunnaki had come to Earth to save their world. What they created here would one day decide whether this one belonged to anyone at all. Control never survives proximity. Once the first humans were sent into the mines, once their days filled with heat, strain, and repetition, the illusion of perfect design began to fracture. They were efficient, yes, stronger than their hominin ancestors, quicker to learn, capable of following complex sequences of instruction. They broke rock, carried ore, sorted fragments glittering with gold dust under a sun that burned without mercy. From orbit, the numbers looked acceptable. From the ground, something else was forming. They watched. They watched the Anunnaki supervisors move without exhaustion, protected by tools that bent light and sound. They watched wounds seal, illnesses vanish, commands delivered without effort. And slowly, without language to name it, comparison took root. Comparison becomes judgment. Judgment becomes hunger. Enlil did not see this, or rather he refused to. To him, the Lulu were assets, rows in an equation that needed balancing. Output up, disruption down. When units failed, they were replaced. When productivity slowed, pressure increased. It was not cruelty in his mind. It was management. Enki saw something else entirely. He walked among them when he could, not as a commander but as an observer. He noticed how they shared food instinctively, how they mourned fallen workers by sitting silently near the bodies, touching foreheads to cooling skin. No directive had instructed this behavior. It had emerged on its own. That disturbed him more than rebellion ever could. The flaw was not mechanical. It was emotional. The deeper problem revealed itself quickly. Sterility. The safeguard that ensured control also ensured fragility. Every accident reduced the workforce permanently. Every illness mattered. Replacement required return to the laboratory, repeated gestation by Anunnaki females, a process both slow and resented. The House of Life was becoming a factory, and even the gods recoiled at that thought. Ninhursag, chief medical authority and guardian of biological law, was the first to speak openly against it. She did not use philosophy. She used bodies. She counted the strain, the damage, the cost. You cannot rebuild a planet with a species that cannot sustain itself, she argued. You are draining us faster than we can replenish them. Enlil demanded solutions, faster production, tighter control, greater efficiency. The language of crisis returned, sharp and unyielding. Enki made his decision in silence. The texts later cloaked the moment in metaphor, because even their scribes could not record it directly. They spoke of a garden, of forbidden knowledge, of a serpent whispering truth. Strip away the poetry, and what remains is intervention. Enki altered the design. He did not announce it. He did not seek approval. He acted when Enlil was absent, away inspecting distant operations. In the House of Life, the genetic locks were opened. The barrier suppressing reproduction was removed. What had been designed as a product became a lineage. The first natural birth changed everything. The child did not emerge under sterile lights, surrounded by instruments and observers. It was born in pain, in blood, held by hands that trembled not with protocol but fear and wonder. The mother screamed, the infant cried. The sound echoed differently than anything the Anunnaki had heard before. It was uncontrolled. It was alive in a way no manufactured being could be. Word spread through the human camps faster than language should allow. A child had been born. Not delivered. Not assembled. Born. The Lulu gathered, touching the infant gently, as if confirming reality with their fingers. They laughed, they wept, they named. In that moment, the experiment escaped containment. When Enlil returned and learned what had been done, the confrontation was immediate and violent. Not physical, but ideological. Accusations cut sharper than weapons. Enki was accused of sabotage, of jeopardizing the mission, of unleashing exponential growth without oversight. Enki responded with numbers of his own: sustainability, replacement rates, long-term viability. Neither spoke of compassion. That word had no place in the argument. This was about control versus consequence. Enlil won the decision, but not the outcome. He ordered separation. The humans were expelled from the protected zones, removed from direct proximity to Anunnaki cities. If they were to multiply, they would do so outside the perimeter of divine care. No more shelter, no more provisioning. Survival would become their responsibility. The fertile land between the rivers, the Eden of later memory, was closed to them. The exile was abrupt. One day, gates opened. The next, they were sealed. Humans who had known structured environments, predictable food, and oversight were pushed into a world of cold nights, predators, and uncertainty. The gods watched from behind walls and from the sky, evaluating outcomes. Many expected collapse. It did not come. Humans adapted with terrifying speed. They learned to shape stone, to bind wood, to trap animals larger than themselves. Fire became companion instead of fear. Groups organized. Roles emerged. What they lacked in strength, they replaced with cooperation. What they lacked in longevity, they compensated with urgency. Enki did not stop watching. He violated orders quietly, teaching through intermediaries, through symbols, through chance encounters disguised as accidents. He showed them which plants nourished and which killed. He taught them to read the sky, to predict floods, to follow seasons that had once dictated only instinct. Knowledge passed hand to hand, generation to generation, faster than the Anunnaki had predicted. The humans were no longer tools. They were becoming a presence. That presence became noise. Not sound alone, though cities carry sound. It was density, activity, thought. From orbit, Earth's biosphere began to glow differently, patterns shifting as settlements expanded. To Enlil, it felt like interference. The mission required focus. Instead, the planet buzzed with life that demanded attention. Offerings, answers. Complaints reached the council, reports of disrupted communications, of human prayers flooding channels not meant for them, of a species that had begun to ask not just how to survive, but why. That question was dangerous. The Anunnaki debated. Once again, crisis framed every word. The humans were multiplying faster than anticipated. Their footprint expanded. Their attention reached upward. Some among the gods saw opportunity. Others saw contamination. Then the sky itself shifted. Observatories detected anomalies, gravitational stress, orbital interactions amplifying tidal forces beyond safe thresholds, a massive instability forming where ice met ocean. The planet was preparing to convulse. To Enlil, this was resolution delivered by physics, no decision required. Let nature erase the error. Let the flood come. To Enki, it was annihilation. The council met one final time. A decree was issued, binding and absolute. Silence. No warning to humanity. No interference. The Anunnaki would evacuate to orbit and observe. Survival would be selective, if it occurred at all. Earth had hosted an experiment. The experiment would end. And as ships prepared for ascent, as platforms powered down and cities dimmed, humanity looked to the sky, unaware that the creators they still believed watched over them had already decided to leave. The abandonment did not begin with absence. It began with silence. Silence settles differently when it is intentional. Before the flood, before the sky darkened and the ground began to tremble, there was a pause that felt unnatural, like a held breath stretched too long. The winds shifted without reason. Animals migrated against instinct. Birds abandoned the wetlands and flew inland in chaotic spirals, as if fleeing a threat they could not see. Humans noticed these things but lacked the language to connect them. They felt unease without cause, dread without shape. The temples went dark first. Where light had once pulsed softly through stone, where the air hummed with a presence that could be felt in the chest, there was nothing. Fires burned lower, offerings went untouched. Prayers echoed back unanswered. For generations, humanity had lived with the certainty that the sky was occupied, that power watched from above. That certainty dissolved quietly, leaving behind a vacuum heavier than fear. Enki felt it more sharply than any of them. Bound by oath, trapped by words carefully chosen to eliminate mercy, he was forbidden from warning his creation. The law was precise. He could not speak to a human. He could not signal. He could not interfere. The Anunnaki had sealed their decision not with cruelty, but with legality, the kind that leaves no room to breathe. Yet Enki was a designer. Designers look for flaws, and laws, like systems, always contain edges. He found his opening not in defiance, but in interpretation. The oath forbade communication with humans. It did not forbid speaking aloud. It did not forbid addressing stone, or wood, or empty space. It did not forbid being overheard. In the city of Shuruppak lived a man named Ziusudra, a name that carried no power at the time. He was not a king. He commanded no armies. He was a priest, a keeper of rituals so small they rarely drew attention. He swept floors. He prepared incense. He spoke to his God in solitude, believing himself unheard but faithful nonetheless. Faith makes people visible. Enki chose him not because he was strong, but because he listened. On a night when the air pressed down like wet cloth and the stars seemed dimmed by unseen haze, Ziusudra slept against the outer wall of Enki's temple. He had prayed there for days, confused by the absence of response, unwilling to abandon the place where answers had once come. His sleep was shallow, fractured by dreams of water rising and voices cut short. The voice that woke him did not speak his name. It spoke to the wall. "O wall of reeds," it said, low and deliberate, "listen, remember." The sound vibrated through the thin structure, through the packed earth beneath it. Ziusudra froze, every instinct screaming to flee, yet rooted by awe. The voice continued, careful, measured, as if reciting instructions to the universe itself. Destroy your house, build a vessel, abandon what you own. Life is the only cargo that matters. Enki never addressed him directly. He spoke as though alone, as though the temple itself were the intended audience. He described dimensions without explaining purpose, shapes without context, a structure with equal length and width, sealed completely, layered with bitumen until water could not enter. No windows, one opening only above. Ziusudra understood none of it, and all of it. He did not question the absurdity. He felt the weight behind the words, the urgency embedded in their rhythm. When the voice spoke of a wave that would erase land, of a destruction sworn and unpreventable, fear replaced confusion. This was not punishment. It was erasure. At dawn, Ziusudra rose and began to work. He lied to survive, to his family, to the craftsmen, to the city that watched him with suspicion as foundations were laid where no river flowed. He told a different story. He spoke of exile, of divine displeasure, of a command to leave the land by water. He framed the coming storms as blessing, not warning. The lie spread more easily than the truth ever could. Construction consumed the days. Wood groaned under strain. Pitch boiled until the air turned black and sharp. The structure grew monstrous and wrong, a cube where curves belonged, a thing that seemed to defy the logic of boats. People laughed, then grew uneasy as the sky reddened and the heat intensified. Animals gathered near the site without coaxing, restless and loud. When the Anunnaki departed, there was no announcement. Their ships rose like artificial stars tearing free from the earth, columns of fire and sound that flattened fields and shattered stone. Humanity watched their gods leave and finally understood abandonment. Panic followed. The gates of the ark closed. Inside, darkness swallowed sound. Then the world broke. The first wave did not crash. It struck, a wall of water driven not by wind but by mass, by gravity distorted beyond balance. The land vanished beneath it. Cities dissolved into slurry. Mountains groaned as pressure redistributed across the crust. Volcanoes tore themselves open, ash and fire feeding the storm. From orbit, the Anunnaki watched. Fear replaced certainty. This was not a cleansing. It was planetary trauma. The water did not rise politely. It scoured. It stripped. It rearranged continents with careless force. Even Enlil fell silent, the scale exceeding projections. The experiment had not simply ended. It had been obliterated. Enki searched for a signal. Days passed, then weeks. The planet calmed slowly, like a wounded animal retreating into stillness. When the waters finally withdrew enough to expose land, the Anunnaki descended to a world unrecognizable. Mud stretched to the horizon. No cities, no forests, no signs of life. Then a reading appeared. A structure. Intact. Impossible. The ark rested against a mountain slope, blackened and steaming under a pale sun. When the hatch opened and Ziusudra emerged, thin and shaking, the universe recalibrated. Enlil raised his weapon. Enki stepped between. The argument that followed did not invoke love. It invoked necessity. Humanity, flawed and loud and dangerous, was now the only workforce left. The gods were starving. Their supplies were gone. Their mission depended on hands that could rebuild. The sacrifice Ziusudra made moments later, the offering of the last of his livestock, sealed the decision more than any debate. The gods gathered like scavengers, drawn by smoke and sustenance, humbled by dependence. Humanity would continue, not as slaves, not as equals, as stewards. The abandonment ended the moment survival required partnership. And somewhere beneath the silence of a changed world, the experiment began again. No longer contained, no longer quiet, and far more dangerous than before. Rebuilding did not begin with stone or fire. It began with counting. After the waters receded, after mud hardened enough to bear weight, the survivors moved cautiously across a planet scraped raw. Landmarks were gone. Rivers had changed their courses. What had once been fertile plains were now scarred expanses of silt and debris. The sky felt higher, emptier, as if something essential had been removed. The Anunnaki descended not as saviors but as planners. Their numbers were reduced, their confidence fractured. They could no longer rely on old systems or brute command. The flood had proven something Enlil had not wanted to accept. Earth was not a passive resource. It reacted. And now, stripped of its former abundance, the planet demanded adaptation from everyone. Humanity became indispensable overnight. The descendants of Ziusudra spread out under instruction that sounded like guidance, but functioned as control. They were taught where to settle, where the ground would eventually yield crops, where new veins of gold had been forced closer to the surface by tectonic violence. The mines of the deep south were gone, drowned and collapsed, but the flood had torn open mountains in distant lands, exposing wealth that had once been unreachable. Labor resumed, but it looked different. There were no longer overseers standing directly over human backs. Instead, there were schedules, quotas, rituals, and expectations embedded into daily life. Work became obligation framed as devotion. The Anunnaki did not need chains when belief could carry the load. The first cities rose quickly. They were not accidental clusters of shelters. They were designed. Streets aligned to the stars. Walls measured precisely. At the center of each city stood a structure unlike any other, rising in stepped layers towards the sky. The ziggurat was not merely a temple. It was a hub, a node where resources were collected, redistributed, and monitored. Grain, livestock, metals, labor hours, all flowed inward. The humans believed they were building homes for gods. In reality, they were constructing administrative centers. The concept of kingship emerged not from human ambition, but divine necessity. The Anunnaki could not manage growing populations directly. They needed intermediaries, humans elevated above others, marked as chosen. The first kings were not rulers in the modern sense. They were managers, tasked with enforcing order, collecting tribute, and maintaining infrastructure. Their authority flowed downward from the gods and upward from fear. Writing followed inevitability. At first, marks pressed into clay recorded simple exchanges, measures of grain, head counts of workers, deliveries of gold dust. These symbols were not poetry. They were accounting. Civilization did not begin with stories. It began with ledgers. Humans learned quickly. They learned irrigation, carving channels that tamed unpredictable rivers into reliable lifelines. They learned agriculture at scale, transforming survival into surplus. They learned metallurgy, turning raw ore into tools that multiplied effort. Each advancement made the system more efficient. Each efficiency increased dependence. The Anunnaki watched humanity accelerate. Some were pleased, others grew uneasy. The old division resurfaced quietly. Enlil's faction viewed humans as a necessary burden, to be managed tightly and never trusted. Enki's lineage saw them as collaborators, dangerous but remarkable, capable of exceeding their original design. These philosophies clashed not in open war, but in policy, in how much knowledge to release and how much to withhold. The humans noticed inconsistencies. One city flourished while another starved. One god rewarded innovation, while another punished deviation. The divine hierarchy was not unified, and humanity lived in the cracks between competing agendas. The noise returned. It was no longer the raw clamor of growth alone. It was conflict. Cities fought cities, believing themselves guided by opposing divine wills. Kings marched armies under banners bearing god names, convinced that victory equaled favor. Blood soaked into soil, barely recovered from floodwaters. The Anunnaki had recreated their own family disputes on a planetary scale. Marduk rose during this chaos. Born of Enki's line, ambitious and sharp, he understood something the others ignored. Humanity was no longer a tool, it was leverage. Where Enlil saw a problem to suppress, Marduk saw power to harness. He positioned himself as protector, lawgiver, architect of order. Humans responded, worship intensified, loyalty deepened. Enlil resisted, but influence had shifted. The gods could not leave again. Not yet. The gold shipments still mattered. Their home world still waited. But their hold on Earth was changing. Direct control was giving way to symbolism. Presence was replaced by myth. Gradually they withdrew from daily visibility. Appearances became rare. Commands came through priests, dreams, omens. The Anunnaki retreated into fortified centers and, eventually, into orbit, leaving behind systems designed to run without them. Civilization was their final invention, more stable than slavery, more efficient than oversight. Humanity thrived inside it. Population exploded. Trade networks expanded. Knowledge accumulated. Writing shifted from numbers to narrative. Myths formed, reshaping memory into story. The gods became less physical, more abstract, easier to forget, easier to reinterpret. This was not an accident. Distance protected the Anunnaki. As generations passed, humans forgot the machines, the ships, the voices that once shook walls. What remained were tales softened by time, gods transformed into symbols rather than supervisors. Eventually, the gold shipments slowed. The mission approached completion. Earth had given what it could. Humanity had grown too complex, too independent, too aware. They were no longer manageable at close range. The decision to leave was not dramatic. There was no second flood, no final decree. The Anunnaki simply stopped returning. Temples lost power. Oracles fell silent. Priests improvised. Kings ruled without confirmation. Humanity stood alone, convinced the gods had ascended beyond reach, unaware that abandonment had been the plan all along. What remained was inheritance, a species engineered for labor now driven by curiosity, systems built for control, repurposed for ambition, myths that concealed truth but preserved its shape. Humanity did not realize it had been released. The experiment had not failed. It had evolved beyond supervision, and far beyond what its creators intended. Memory decays unevenly. Some things vanish quickly, like footprints after rain. Others harden, fossilize, and survive far beyond their usefulness. Long after the Anunnaki withdrew from daily presence, long after the last ship lifted silently into the upper dark, fragments of their influence remained embedded in human behavior like splinters beneath skin. Humanity no longer saw gods walking among them, yet they continued to act as if someone was watching. The systems endured. Kings still ruled by divine right, even when no divine voice confirmed it. Temples still collected offerings, though the recipients never arrived. Priests still interpreted signs in smoke and stars, translating silence into certainty. Civilization ran on momentum, a machine designed for oversight that now governed itself. This was not freedom. It was inheritance without instructions. Human societies expanded rapidly, driven by surplus and competition. Agriculture fed cities. Cities demanded walls. Walls demanded armies. War became ritualized, justified not by necessity but by belief. Each city-state claimed cosmic favor. Each loss was explained as failure of devotion rather than flawed leadership. The old Anunnaki divisions lived on, disguised as theology. One god demanded order, another celebrated cunning, another rewarded conquest. Humans aligned themselves accordingly, shaping cultures around traits that mirrored the personalities of long-absent overseers. What had once been administrative preferences hardened into moral law. Technology advanced unevenly. Humans mastered bronze, then iron. They mapped the skies, named stars, tracked cycles with impressive accuracy, but certain leaps never came. Energy systems hinted at in ancient myths were gone. Knowledge once taught directly now survived only as symbol. The serpent, once a sign of genetic wisdom, became temptation. The flood, once a planetary event, became punishment. Truth blurred into allegory. And yet something stirred beneath the surface. As populations grew denser, as trade connected distant lands, ideas moved faster than armies. People compared gods. They noticed contradictions. Why did one city's god demand blood while another favored law? Why did prayers sometimes fail no matter how faithfully they were offered? Doubt emerged quietly. Philosophers questioned divine consistency. Scribes recorded not just what rulers decreed, but what actually happened. Memory shifted from myth to analysis. For the first time since creation, humanity began to look inward for answers. This frightened what remained of the old order. Those who benefited from divine authority reacted by tightening control. Laws grew harsher. Heresy became crime. Dissent was framed as chaos. The absence of gods made their shadows more dangerous, not less. Power clung to belief, because belief was all it had left. Empires rose. They did not resemble the city-states of old. They were vast, spanning continents, absorbing cultures, enforcing unity through force. Their rulers no longer claimed to speak with gods daily. Instead, they claimed to embody divine will permanently. The distinction mattered. The gods were becoming unnecessary. From a distance far beyond Earth, observation continued. The Anunnaki did not vanish into myth as completely as humanity believed. They watched intermittently, not out of guardianship but curiosity. Their creation had outlived utility and grown unpredictable. The experiment had exceeded its parameters. Some argued for intervention. Humanity still possessed value. Others argued the opposite. The species had become noisy again, not in sound, but in signal. Its emissions filled the electromagnetic spectrum. Fires lit the night side of the planet. Patterns emerged detectable from orbit. Earth was no longer quiet. The decision was restraint. Intervention had consequences. The flood had proven that. The Anunnaki chose distance, allowing humanity to progress without guidance or correction. If the species destroyed itself, that would be resolution. If it transcended limitations, that would be spectacle. Humanity crossed thresholds unaware it was being measured. Writing transformed into philosophy, philosophy into science, science into industry, Each step pulled humanity further from its origin story. Gods became metaphors. Creation myths became cultural artifacts. The idea of being designed was dismissed as primitive. Yet the design persisted. Humans worked obsessively. They organized hierarchies instinctively. They extracted resources with urgency that bordered on compulsion. Gold retained symbolic value long after it lost practical necessity. Something in the species responded to it, not rationally but reflexively. The old directive lingered. As machines replaced muscle, as factories replaced fields, humanity approached a familiar pattern. Efficiency increased. Output soared. The planet strained, atmosphere changed, oceans warmed, extraction accelerated without pause. From orbit, the resemblance was unmistakable. A species on a finite world behaving as if survival depended on endless growth. The Anunnaki had seen this before. Debate resumed among them, not heated but reflective. Humanity was replaying their own history at compressed speed. The same mistakes, the same blindness, the same refusal to slow down. But there was a difference. Humanity did not possess the technology to escape its planet yet. It was racing toward crisis without an exit strategy. The experiment was reaching a second inflection point, one no creator could resolve without revealing themselves. And revelation carried risk. Back on Earth, myths fractured further. Religions split and multiplied. Some promised salvation beyond the world. Others promised dominion over it. None addressed the underlying problem. Humanity no longer remembered why it existed, only that it must continue. Noise returned again, louder than ever. Not the noise of prayer or war, but the noise of machines, of cities that never slept, of signals broadcast into space without awareness of who might listen. Humanity announced itself to the universe, proud, defiant, unafraid. From a distance, the message was clear. The experiment had developed agency. Whether that agency would lead to collapse or contact was no longer predictable. The creators could no longer claim authorship of the outcome. What they had started had learned to write its own future. Abandonment had done what control never could. It had forced evolution. And now, as humanity stood unknowingly on the edge of another transformation, the silence from above was not absence. It was deliberation. Deliberation has weight. It stretches time, bends intention, and leaves those below unaware that they are being measured against futures they cannot see. Humanity entered its modern age believing it had finally escaped the long shadow of gods, convinced that reason had replaced myth and autonomy had replaced obedience. Yet the patterns that governed its ascent were not new. They were refinements of an older script, written long before memory learned how to record itself. The industrial age did not erupt randomly. It unfolded with mechanical inevitability. Coal replaced muscle. Steam replaced wind. Machines multiplied output beyond any biological limit. Cities expanded vertically, not because humans preferred it, but because density had always been rewarded. The same logic that once packed workers into mining camps now stacked families into tenements. Efficiency over comfort, production over sustainability. Gold no longer functioned as planetary medicine, but it retained authority. It anchored currencies, justified conquest, dictated power. Even stripped of practical necessity, it commanded obsession. Humanity dug deeper, extracted faster, hoarded compulsively. The old directive echoed without explanation. Progress accelerated. Electricity lit nights that once belonged to stars. Communication crossed oceans instantly. Distance collapsed. The planet shrank. With every innovation, humanity stepped further from its origin while reenacting its core purpose: extract, refine, expand. The noise became measurable. Radio waves leaked into space, then television, then radar, then continuous digital transmission. Earth began broadcasting itself unintentionally, a sphere wrapped in electromagnetic chatter. To any observer beyond the planet, it was no longer dormant or primitive. It was active, loud, unmistakably technological. The Anunnaki noticed, not with urgency, but with recognition. This stage was familiar. A civilization approaching the threshold, where invention outpaces wisdom, where tools develop faster than restraint, where the ability to destroy outruns the ability to decide whether destruction is acceptable. They had crossed that threshold once. On Earth, humanity framed its own rise as triumph. Science promised mastery over nature. Economics promised endless growth. Politics promised control. But beneath those promises ran stress fractures. Pollution thickened air and water. Species vanished quietly. Climate systems destabilized. The planet responded, not with malice, but with physics. Warnings were issued, then ignored. Human institutions were excellent at short-term optimization and catastrophically poor at long-term survival. Every solution generated new problems. Every fix postponed reckoning. Humanity behaved as if time itself were an infinite resource. From above, the resemblance to Nibiru's decline was uncomfortable. The Anunnaki debated again, though the tone had changed. This was no longer about intervention to extract value. That phase had ended. It was about observation of outcome. Had the experiment failed? Or had it produced something capable of avoiding the mistakes of its makers? Evidence was mixed. Humanity displayed creativity far beyond its initial design. Art, music, abstract thought, compassion extended beyond kin. These traits had not been engineered deliberately. They had emerged. At the same time, the species demonstrated a talent for self-deception, tribalism, and violence that scaled with technology. The danger was no longer local. Nuclear weapons condensed planetary annihilation into minutes. Artificial intelligence began replicating decision-making itself. Genetic engineering crept toward the same boundaries the Anunnaki had once crossed, unaware of the irony. Humanity stood at the edge of becoming its own creator. The silence from above continued. On Earth, the absence of gods did not lead to unity. It led to fragmentation. Ideologies replaced deities. Nations replaced city-states. Loyalty shifted from divine symbols to flags and currencies. The structure remained. Only the language changed. Work remained central. Despite automation, despite abundance, humanity refused to stop working. It measured worth in productivity. It equated rest with failure. Even as machines outperformed humans, humans competed with machines, accelerating pace, compressing life into tasks. The ancient purpose had mutated but not vanished. Extract, produce, deliver. This obsession drove the planet closer to collapse. Yet something unexpected occurred. A countercurrent emerged, quiet at first. Movements that questioned growth. Voices that valued sustainability over expansion. Humans began to study their own impact with scientific rigor, mapping consequences beyond a single generation. The idea of stewardship gained traction, not as command from gods, but as ethical necessity. For the first time, humanity began to restrain itself voluntarily. It was imperfect, often hypocritical, frequently reversed, but the impulse existed. A species designed to obey external control was learning internal regulation. That mattered. The Anunnaki took note. Restraint had been their failure. They had relied on technological solutions to existential problems while ignoring behavioral ones. Humanity, lacking their power, was forced to confront limits sooner. Still, time was short. Climate feedback loops accelerated. Systems destabilized faster than policy could adapt. Humanity faced a narrowing corridor of survivable futures. Collapse was possible. Transformation was possible. Stagnation was not. From orbit, the question sharpened. Was intervention justified? Reappearance would shatter belief systems, destabilize governments, fracture societies. Humanity was no longer a blank slate. It carried billions of lives, cultures, histories. Contact could trigger chaos equal to extinction. Non-intervention carried its own risks. A self-inflicted collapse could erase the species entirely, closing the experiment without resolution. The Anunnaki had not anticipated attachment. Enki, observing humanity's attempts to correct course, felt something unfamiliar. Not responsibility, that had faded long ago. Recognition. Humanity was repeating the cycle, but with awareness the Anunnaki had lacked at the same stage. The species was flawed, loud, destructive, and astonishingly adaptive. A civilization capable of creating myths about gods might eventually grow beyond the need for them. A species that questioned its own origin might one day uncover the truth without assistance. Perhaps abandonment had been necessary, after all. On Earth, humanity stood at a crossroads without knowing it was being watched. Its broadcasts reached farther into space. Its probes left the solar system. Its eyes turned outward again, searching for others, asking questions once reserved for gods. Are we alone? The answer hovered just beyond detection, withheld not by distance, but by choice. The experiment had reached the point where guidance would corrupt the result. Whatever came next would have to be earned, not given. Silence endured, not as neglect, but as the final test. And for the first time since creation, the outcome no longer belonged to the creators. The test did not announce itself. It arrived disguised as choice, scattered across billions of individual decisions that felt insignificant on their own. Humanity believed it was navigating history freely, unaware that every path forward narrowed toward the same essential question. Could a species engineered under control learn to govern itself without annihilation? The first signs were internal, not cosmic. Humanity began turning its tools inward. Data replaced instinct. Algorithms predicted behavior. Surveillance normalized. Efficiency became justification for intrusion. The same logic that once optimized mining camps now optimized populations. Humans tracked themselves obsessively, measuring productivity, consumption, loyalty. Control no longer required gods. Humanity provided it willingly. Power consolidated. Corporations grew larger than nations. Wealth abstracted itself into digital symbols detached from physical labor. Decision-making centralized while accountability diffused. The distance between action and consequence widened, allowing damage to accumulate unnoticed. Gold lost its physical form, but not its function. It became capital, influence, leverage. Extraction continued, now focused not only on minerals but on attention, data, and time. Humanity mined itself. The planet strained further, weather destabilized, oceans acidified, forests thinned. These were not sudden catastrophes, but slow erosions, easy to ignore, hard to reverse. Humanity acknowledged them rhetorically while postponing meaningful response. Short-term survival instincts overrode long-term planning, as they always had. From above, the pattern repeated. Civilizations rarely collapsed from ignorance. They collapsed from denial. Yet something resisted the collapse. Across cultures, individuals and groups rejected the script. They dismantled assumptions. They questioned inherited systems. They imagined futures not built on domination or endless growth. These movements were fragile, often marginalized, but persistent. They did not seek gods. They sought balance. This divergence mattered. Humanity was no longer unified in trajectory. It splintered into competing visions of survival. One path accelerated extraction, betting on technological escape, colonize other planets, engineer solutions, transcend biology. The other path emphasized restraint, integration with planetary systems, acceptance of limits. Both paths carried risk. The first mirrored the Anunnaki's mistake. The second demanded sacrifice humanity had historically resisted. The experiment entered its most unstable phase, where multiple futures existed simultaneously, each fragile, each contested. Noise increased again. This time, it was not prayer or broadcast alone. It was intention. Humanity began sending deliberate messages into space, announcing presence, seeking contact. The species that once feared gods now invited observers. The Anunnaki debated the implications carefully. Contact at this stage could redirect humanity irreversibly. It could unify or fracture. It could accelerate progress or trigger panic. The risk was no longer contamination of a workforce. It was interference with agency. They examined human media, philosophy, science. They studied the species' self-image. Humanity saw itself as accidental, evolved, autonomous. Revelation of design would destabilize identity at a foundational level. Faith systems would collapse or radicalize. Political structures would exploit disclosure. Violence was not hypothetical, it was probable. Non-contact preserved autonomy, but risked extinction. The Anunnaki weighed another factor they had not considered before. Humanity had begun replicating them. Not biologically, but functionally. Artificial intelligence systems now optimized logistics, predicted behavior, allocated resources. Humans debated granting them autonomy, authority, even rights. They stood on the edge of creating entities to manage complexity beyond human cognition. The irony was sharp. A species created to solve a labor crisis was now creating its own replacements. The cycle threatened to repeat, with humans in the role of gods and machines in the role of Lulu. Would humanity show restraint where its creators had not? Some argued yes. Ethical frameworks emerged alongside technology, safeguards debated, limits proposed. Others argued inevitability. Efficiency would override caution. Control would justify compromise. The test tightened. Humanity's search for meaning intensified. Traditional religions declined in some regions, surged in others. New belief systems formed around science, technology, identity. The need for narrative persisted. Humans could not function without story. If gods did not exist, substitutes would be created. The Anunnaki recognized this intimately. They had become myths to survive absence. Humanity now mythologized itself. From orbit, Earth glowed brighter at night than ever before. Not with reverence, but activity. A planet alive with intention, struggling against its own momentum. The question shifted. It was no longer whether humanity could survive. It was whether it could mature. Maturity, for a species, did not mean peace or perfection. It meant recognizing limits, accepting responsibility, and acting collectively despite individual cost. The Anunnaki had failed this test. They had relied on extraction and technological patches until collapse forced desperation. Humanity stood closer to the edge, but with more awareness. That awareness was uneven. Many rejected it, many denied it, but it existed. Time compressed, feedback loops shortened, decisions carried consequences faster. The margin for error narrowed. Humanity could no longer afford centuries of adjustment. It had decades, perhaps less. The Anunnaki remained silent. Silence was no longer distance, it was respect. For the first time, humanity was not being observed as property or experiment. It was being observed as a peer in potential, if not in power. The creators did not know the outcome. That uncertainty marked the final stage. Humanity was no longer defined by its origin, its design, or its past utility. It was defined by its next choice, multiplied billions of times over. Whether it would repeat the fate of its makers or transcend it remained unresolved. The silence endured. Not because the universe was empty, but because the answer was still forming. The answer did not arrive as revelation. It emerged as tension, stretched thin across generations who felt the weight of inherited systems pressing down on choices they never agreed to make. Humanity had become aware of its trajectory without fully understanding its momentum. It sensed danger but argued endlessly about direction, mistaking motion for progress and noise for vitality. Technology promised escape. Orbiting stations became permanent. Plans for lunar industry and Martian settlement moved from speculation to blueprint. The language of survival shifted outward. If Earth could not sustain infinite growth, perhaps space could. The idea was seductive, expansion without consequence, frontiers without limits. It echoed an older dream, one the Anunnaki themselves had believed until physics dismantled it. The flaw was scale. Humanity reached outward while still failing inward. Inequality widened. Access to technology stratified populations. The benefits of advancement pooled at the top while costs dispersed across the planet. Progress became uneven, accelerating some lives while shortening others. The species advanced together only in theory. This imbalance destabilized trust. Trust is foundational for collective survival. Without it, coordination fractures. Humanity's institutions strained under conflicting incentives. Governments reacted slower than markets. Markets reacted faster than ethics. Ethics lagged behind consequences. Each system optimized locally, undermining the whole. The planet responded indifferently. Storms intensified, droughts deepened, ice retreated. These were not punishments, they were feedback. The planet adjusted to new conditions regardless of human preference. Humanity framed these changes as crises, but from a planetary perspective, they were recalibrations. Some adapted. Cities redesigned infrastructure, energy systems shifted, agriculture evolved. Humans demonstrated remarkable ingenuity when compelled. Yet adaptation remained reactive, driven by disaster rather than foresight. For every solution implemented, two were postponed. From beyond Earth, observation sharpened. The Anunnaki saw a pattern they had never fully escaped: intelligence outpacing wisdom. Humanity could model climate systems in exquisite detail while failing to act on the predictions. It could simulate futures and still choose denial. Knowledge did not guarantee behavior. But behavior was changing. Younger generations questioned assumptions. Older ones defended instinctively. Ownership lost appeal. Cooperation gained value. Identity shifted from dominance toward participation. These changes were subtle, uneven, and often resisted, but they accumulated. Culture began to mutate faster than biology. Ideas spread at light speed. Norms evolved within decades rather than centuries. Humanity's greatest advantage was no longer physical adaptation, but mimetic flexibility. The species could reprogram itself socially in real time. This was new. The Anunnaki had relied on genetic and technological solutions. Humanity experimented with cultural ones. It redefined success, at least in pockets. It challenged hierarchies once considered inevitable. It imagined systems beyond extraction and control. Not everyone agreed. Resistance hardened. Those invested in old structures fought to preserve them. Conflict intensified, not between nations alone, but between world views. Humanity entered an era of ideological turbulence where consensus became rare and compromise fragile. The noise peaked, not as volume, but as signal density. Every narrative competed simultaneously. Truth fragmented. Authority dissolved. The species struggled to orient itself amid infinite information. Yet from chaos emerged pattern. Humanity began developing meta-awareness, the ability to observe its own systems critically. Fields merged. Science informed ethics. Ethics challenged economics. Economics reconsidered growth. These conversations were incomplete, messy, often derailed, but they existed. The Anunnaki recognized this as maturation, not resolution, but potential. For the first time, humanity confronted the possibility that survival required collective restraint rather than individual success. That progress might mean slowing down. That intelligence carried responsibility beyond advantage. The question of contact resurfaced. Humanity searched the sky more deliberately now, scanning for signals, designing messages not as pleas but as introductions. The tone shifted, no longer asking for salvation, asking for company. The Anunnaki weighed this carefully. Contact now would not recreate ancient dependency. Humanity no longer needed gods to explain lightning or floods. It sought understanding, not authority. Still, revelation carried risk. Knowledge of origin could destabilize identity, or it could contextualize it. The creators considered a different approach, not intervention, not disclosure. Influence through absence had shaped humanity profoundly. Perhaps the final guidance would be indirect again, embedded not in words but in consequence. Let humanity encounter others when ready. Let it discover truth through exploration rather than inheritance. Earth's probes crossed boundaries. Signals reached farther. Humanity stepped into the cosmic arena cautiously, aware now that it was not the center of anything. This humility mattered. Civilizations collapse when they believe themselves exceptional beyond accountability. Humanity flirted with that belief repeatedly. Now, cracks formed in the illusion. The universe revealed itself as vast, indifferent, and old. Humanity felt small, not insignificant, but unprivileged. From a distance, the experiment approached resolution, not success or failure, but independence. The Anunnaki had created a species to solve a problem. That species had outgrown the problem and inherited the consequences. It carried echoes of its origin, but not chains. It stumbled, learned, resisted, adapted. Whether humanity would survive remained uncertain. But for the first time, Survival depended entirely on itself. The silence from above persisted, not as judgment, not as neglect, as recognition that the experiment no longer required oversight. Whatever humanity became next would not belong to its creators. It would belong to the future it chose to build. Choice, once internalized, becomes burden. Humanity carried it unevenly, some embracing it with urgency, others rejecting it outright. Freedom revealed itself not as liberation, but as responsibility without appeal. There were no gods left to blame, no creators to petition, no external authority to reverse consequences. The species stood exposed to its own decisions. This exposure reshaped fear. Old fears had been concrete: famine, invasion, divine punishment. New fears were abstract and pervasive: systemic collapse, ecological tipping points, artificial intelligence surpassing human control. Pandemics accelerated by hyperconnectivity. These were not enemies that could be defeated. They were conditions humanity itself generated. The illusion of separation eroded. Economic systems no longer respected borders. Environmental damage ignored sovereignty. Digital networks collapsed distance entirely. Humanity experienced itself as a single organism for the first time, one where failure in one region propagated everywhere. Coordination became essential, and coordination proved difficult. The institutions designed to manage smaller, slower societies struggled under global complexity. Decision-making lagged behind reality. Short-term incentives undermined long-term survival. Humanity had intelligence in abundance, but coherence in short supply. Still, adaptation continued. Localized solutions emerged where global ones stalled. Communities redesigned food systems. Cities decarbonized faster than nations. Informal networks solved problems bureaucracy could not. These efforts rarely dominated headlines, but they accumulated quietly. The species learned sideways. This distributed intelligence marked a departure from earlier patterns. Rather than waiting for centralized authority, humans increasingly acted independently, yet cooperatively. The same trait that once made them difficult to control now became their advantage. The creators had not anticipated this. The Anunnaki had engineered obedience with limits. They had not designed resilience through decentralization. Humanity's greatest strength emerged not from its origin, but from what had been neglected. As exploration expanded beyond Earth, humanity encountered new constraints. Space was not empty. It was hostile, expensive, unforgiving. Every gram mattered. Every error compounded. The dream of easy escape dissolved under engineering reality. Colonization required discipline, cooperation, and sacrifice at levels humanity had rarely sustained. This forced introspection. If survival beyond Earth demanded unity, then survival on Earth demanded it first. The planet remained the most forgiving environment humanity would ever know. Destroying it in pursuit of elsewhere became increasingly irrational. That realization shifted priorities. Investment moved toward preservation, not because of altruism, but because of necessity. Earth was not replaceable. The fantasy of unlimited expansion faded. Limits reasserted themselves. The Anunnaki observed a familiar crossroads. This was the moment they had failed. Their own civilization had refused limits until desperation drove exploitation of another world. Humanity, faced with similar pressures, hesitated, not universally, not cleanly, but noticeably. Ethics entered engineering. The debate over artificial intelligence crystallized this shift. Humanity recognized the danger of creating systems that optimized without values. Safeguards were proposed. oversight demanded. Progress slowed deliberately in some sectors, an unprecedented move in a species defined by acceleration. This restraint was fragile. Powerful incentives still pushed for speed. Competition rewarded those who ignored caution. Yet the conversation itself mattered. Humanity was no longer blindly repeating history. It was referencing it, even if unknowingly. Memory returned in another form. Ancient myths resurfaced not as belief, but as metaphor. Stories of fallen civilizations, floods, hubris, and abandonment gained relevance. Humanity began to read its own past differently, recognizing patterns rather than dismissing them as superstition. The absence of gods created space for wisdom. Wisdom, unlike intelligence, does not scale easily. It requires patience, humility, and acceptance of uncertainty. Humanity struggled with these, but the struggle itself indicated growth. From orbit, Earth's signals changed, not in volume, but in content. Humanity's transmissions carried curiosity more than conquest. Its probes carried questions, not demands. The species no longer assumed it was alone or exceptional. It prepared for contact without expecting dominance. The Anunnaki debated one final time. Not whether to intervene, but whether intervention was still possible without corruption. Humanity's trajectory had diverged enough that guidance might now hinder rather than help. The creators faced a reversal. They were now the ones at risk of becoming obsolete. That realization settled heavily. Creators rarely accept irrelevance gracefully, but relevance imposed responsibility, and responsibility risked repeating old mistakes. Silence remained the safest course. On Earth, humanity reached a fragile equilibrium, not stability, but awareness. The knowledge that extinction was possible, that survival required cooperation beyond tribe, nation, or ideology, that technology without ethics was insufficient, that growth without limits was terminal. This awareness did not unify humanity overnight, but it reframed conflict. Wars became harder to justify. Exploitation faced resistance. Systems adapted slowly, unevenly, often painfully, yet the direction shifted. The experiment approached its conclusion not with spectacle, but with quiet transformation. Humanity did not transcend its nature, it integrated it. Aggression remained, fear remained, desire remained, but they were increasingly balanced by foresight, empathy, and shared risk. From the cold distance of space, Earth no longer resembled a resource or a laboratory. It resembled a civilization, imperfect, unstable, unfinished, but no longer a failure. Whatever the Anunnaki had intended, whatever had been lost or abandoned, humanity had moved beyond the need for correction. The test was not passed in triumph. It was passed in persistence. And for the first time since the experiment began, the outcome felt earned. Persistence reshaped identity. Humanity no longer defined itself solely by survival or dominance, but by continuity. The idea that tomorrow mattered as much as today took root slowly, resisted by instincts honed in scarcity, yet reinforced by evidence that short-term victory often produced long-term loss. The species did not become wiser all at once. It became cautious in fragments. The greatest shift occurred not in technology, but in narrative. For millennia, humanity had framed existence as struggle against external forces: gods, nature, enemies, fate. Now the story turned inward. The primary challenge was no longer what opposed humanity, but what it unleashed through its own momentum. This reframing altered priorities. It did not eliminate conflict, But it changed what victory meant. Control lost its glamour. Centralized power revealed vulnerabilities. Systems too rigid shattered under pressure. Humanity learned, often painfully, that resilience came from redundancy, diversity, and adaptability. Monocultures failed. Singular ideologies fractured. Uniform solutions broke under local realities. The species began to favor ecosystems over empires. Cities redesigned themselves not as monuments to dominance, but as integrated organisms. Energy systems decentralized. Food production localized. Waste cycles closed. These changes were uneven and contested, but they represented a philosophical departure. Humanity began treating its environment not as an enemy to subdue, but as a partner to negotiate with. This was unprecedented. The Anunnaki had never reached this stage. Their response to scarcity had been extraction and relocation. Humanity responded with optimization and restraint, not perfectly, but intentionally. The distinction mattered. Exploration continued, but its tone shifted. Space was no longer viewed as escape, but as extension. Probes carried instruments designed to learn, not claim. Missions prioritized understanding over conquest. Humanity recognized that exporting its problems into the cosmos without resolving them at home would only multiply risk. Contact protocols were drafted not from fear, but from humility. Humanity prepared for the possibility of others with the assumption that it might not be superior. This marked a radical departure from earlier assumptions of centrality and entitlement. The universe was approached as shared, not owned. From afar, this shift registered clearly. The Anunnaki recognized the pattern as maturation rather than compliance. Humanity was no longer acting because it had been taught to, but because it understood consequences. The difference was subtle, but decisive. Yet danger remained. The species still carried destructive potential. Weapons existed that could erase civilization within hours. Systems remained fragile. Political fractures persisted. The test was ongoing, not concluded. What changed was response to failure. When mistakes occurred, denial was increasingly challenged, accountability gained traction, transparency, once feared, became tool. Humanity began exposing its own flaws publicly, dissecting them, learning in real time. This self-awareness was disruptive. Old authorities weakened. New forms of leadership emerged, less charismatic, more collaborative. Success shifted from dominance to coordination. Influence derived from trust rather than fear. The creators had not anticipated trust as a survival mechanism. Their civilization had been hierarchical, efficient, brittle. Humanity's emerging structure was messier, slower, but more resilient. It sacrificed elegance for adaptability. As generations passed, myths evolved again. The old gods faded further into abstraction. Creation stories became allegories about responsibility rather than origin. Humanity no longer needed to believe it was created for a purpose. It began creating purpose deliberately. Meaning became chosen, not inherited. This autonomy carried weight. Without external justification, actions demanded internal ethics. Humanity grappled with this unevenly, but the struggle itself marked independence. From orbit, Earth's signature stabilized. Energy use plateaued. Atmospheric indicators slowed their drift. Biodiversity loss decelerated in some regions. These were not reversals, but signs of restraint. The species learned to pull back before collapse, a skill its creators had lacked. The Anunnaki debated whether this was coincidence or consequence. Was humanity succeeding because of its design or despite it? The answer mattered less than outcome. The experiment had produced something unexpected, a species capable of self-correction. Not flawless, not harmonious, but responsive. That responsiveness was the threshold. At this point, intervention would not accelerate growth. It would infantilize. Revelation would reintroduce dependency, resurrect hierarchies, destabilize hard-won autonomy. Silence remained the only ethical choice. On Earth, humanity's gaze turned outward again, not with urgency, but curiosity. The question was no longer whether others existed, but how to meet them without repeating old mistakes. The universe was no longer backdrop. It was context. Humanity prepared itself not as conqueror or supplicant, but as participant. The distinction mattered. The Anunnaki observed a familiar emotion rise within themselves. Regret, not regret for creation, but for their own failure to reach this stage before desperation forced exploitation. Humanity had arrived here under pressure, guided by consequence rather than instruction. That difference might determine survival. The experiment had not failed. It had concluded in a way no creator could script. Humanity stood on the threshold of becoming what its makers never were, a civilization that learned from history before repeating it beyond repair. Whether that lesson would endure remained uncertain. But for the first time, the uncertainty belonged entirely to humanity. And that, at last, was the point. Uncertainty matured into discipline. Humanity learned that foresight was not a prediction, but a practice, one that demanded constant adjustment rather than singular breakthroughs. The future ceased to be a destination and became a process, shaped continuously by feedback, restraint, and revision. This shift altered how the species measured success. Victory no longer meant expansion alone. It meant endurance. Institutions adapted slowly, but adaptation occurred. Long-term modeling informed policy. Environmental thresholds were treated as boundaries rather than challenges to overcome. Economic systems began accounting for depletion, not just growth. These changes were neither universal nor permanent, but they signaled a departure from reckless acceleration. Humanity internalized limits. The psychological transformation was subtle, yet profound. Earlier generations had lived as if tomorrow could absorb today's excesses. Now, consequences were visible within a single lifetime. Children inherited altered climates. Cities confronted rising seas. Memory compressed. Lessons once forgotten across centuries now lingered across decades. This immediacy sharpened responsibility. Humanity's relationship with technology shifted again. Tools were no longer celebrated simply for capability, but evaluated for impact. Artificial intelligence systems were constrained by ethical frameworks, not perfectly enforced, but actively debated. Genetic engineering was approached with caution, informed by historical analogy rather than ambition alone. The species remembered, dimly, what happened when creators overstepped. Even without knowing the origin of that memory, the instinct persisted. Cooperation expanded beyond borders in pragmatic ways, data shared, research coordinated, crises managed collectively when possible. Failure still occurred, but isolation became less acceptable. Humanity learned that no region could insulate itself indefinitely from global systems. This realization softened identity. National myths retained power, but planetary identity gained traction. Earth was increasingly framed as a shared vessel, fragile and finite. The metaphor resonated because it matched lived experience. Humanity understood containment instinctively now. Exploration continued under new assumptions. When humanity ventured farther into space, it did so with redundancy, caution, and humility. Missions prioritized sustainability over spectacle. Survival planning replaced conquest narratives. The cosmos was not a frontier to tame, but an environment to respect. From a distance, this mattered. The Anunnaki recognized the transformation as authentic. Humanity was not merely mimicking restraint under pressure, it was institutionalizing it. Structures emerged to preserve memory, ensuring lessons would not fade easily. The species began archiving itself deliberately. Not just data, but context. Stories, failures, ethical debates. Humanity built systems to remind itself of past errors, to resist the cycle of forgetting that had doomed earlier civilizations. This was an act of self-awareness the Anunnaki had never attempted. Memory became infrastructure. This development reduced the need for external oversight. Humanity became its own regulator, imperfect but evolving. The role of gods, once central, dissolved entirely. Divinity became metaphor for values rather than authority. The creators faded further into irrelevance, not because they were forgotten, but because they were no longer needed. The question of contact resurfaced one final time, framed differently, not as rescue or revelation, but as dialogue. Humanity prepared for the possibility of meeting others without expecting guidance or dominance. Protocols emphasized reciprocity, consent, and caution. This approach surprised the Anunnaki. It reflected maturity beyond the species' age. Humanity was still young by cosmic standards, but age mattered less than behavior. The species had compressed development through crisis. From orbit, Earth appeared stable in new ways, not static, but balanced. Energy flows moderated, systems adapted dynamically. The planet still faced challenges, but it no longer hurtled blindly toward collapse. Feedback loops shortened, corrections occurred sooner, the experiment reached closure quietly. There was no signal to mark success, no ceremony, no acknowledgement. The creators simply recognized that their presence would add nothing. Humanity's trajectory belonged to itself now. This recognition carried mixed emotions: pride tempered by humility, relief shadowed by regret. The Anunnaki had created life to save themselves. That life had saved itself instead. The creators had become witnesses to an outcome they could not control or claim. Humanity did not know this. It continued building, questioning, refining. It made mistakes, corrected them, argued, adapted. The absence of gods became ordinary, not threatening. Meaning emerged from action rather than origin. The species moved forward without looking back. From a cosmic perspective, this was rare. Most experiments either collapse or stagnate. Humanity did neither. It destabilized, recalibrated, and persisted. Its success was not perfection, but resilience. The Anunnaki accepted this. They withdrew attention, not in abandonment, but in respect. Observation shifted to distance. Intervention was abandoned entirely. The experiment had exceeded its scope. Humanity was no longer a project, it was a civilization. Whether it would endure for millennia or vanish in future cycles was no longer relevant to its creators. Survival was no longer their responsibility. And for the first time since the beginning, the silence above Earth was not a test. It was acknowledgement. Acknowledgement does not arrive as comfort. It arrives as distance, a widening gap where guidance once existed. Humanity felt this as a subtle loneliness, not despair, but the quiet realization that no higher authority would intervene if things went wrong. The universe did not lean in. It waited. This waiting reshaped ambition. Humanity's long obsession with legacy softened. Monuments mattered less than continuity. Projects were designed to outlast individuals, even generations. Infrastructure assumed caretakers, yet unborn. Decisions were weighed against futures that could not speak. This was not altruism. It was survival logic refined into ethics. The species learned to think in centuries. Education changed first. Knowledge was no longer framed as accumulation alone, but as stewardship. Students were taught not only how systems worked, but how they failed. Collapse became a subject of study, not taboo. Humanity cataloged its near extinctions with uncomfortable honesty. Mistakes were no longer erased. They were preserved. This altered innovation. New technologies were tested not only for performance, but for long-term impact. Redundancy became virtue. Simplicity regained value. Humanity learned that complexity without comprehension was a liability. The planet responded. Ecosystems stabilized where pressure eased. Rivers adjusted to restored floodplains. Species returned where habitats recovered. These were not miracles. They were confirmations that restraint worked. Earth did not require domination to cooperate. It required space. The psychological effect was profound. Humanity stopped seeing itself as separate from its environment. The old metaphor of conquest gave way to one of participation. Survival was no longer imagined as victory over nature, but continuity within it. Conflict did not vanish. It evolved. Disputes centered less on territory and more on values. Ideological clashes intensified even as physical wars declined. Humanity argued fiercely about direction, meaning, and risk tolerance. This friction was uncomfortable but necessary. It prevented stagnation. From afar, the Anunnaki observed humanity's internalization of what they themselves had externalized. Where the creators had relied on technology to shield consequences, humanity integrated consequence into decision-making. It was slower, messier, but more stable. The species entered a phase of deliberate vulnerability. It acknowledged that no system was permanent, that collapse remained possible, that vigilance was ongoing. This humility protected against overconfidence, the trait that had undone many before. Exploration resumed cautiously. Humanity reached beyond its solar system with probes designed for patience rather than conquest. These machines carried archives of human knowledge, not declarations of ownership. They listened more than they spoke. They were ambassadors of curiosity, not dominance. The silence they encountered did not discourage them, it contextualized them. Humanity began to understand the universe not as empty, but as reserved. Civilizations, if they existed elsewhere, might also choose silence. The absence of voices did not imply absence of life. It implied caution. This insight softened expectations. Humanity no longer demanded contact. It prepared for it responsibly. It accepted that meeting others would require maturity, not technology alone. Readiness became ethical, not technical. The Anunnaki recognized the irony. They had once feared humanity's noise. Now humanity learned the value of quiet, not as submission, but as respect. Silence became a language of restraint. This marked a turning point. The experiment had not only produced autonomy, it had produced discretion. On Earth, mythology transformed one final time. The old gods faded into symbols of forces rather than beings. Creation stories were reinterpreted as warnings, not origins. Humanity no longer sought validation from its past. It sought alignment with its future. Identity stabilized around responsibility. Humans defined themselves less by what they ruled and more by what they preserved. Success was measured in systems sustained rather than enemies defeated. This redefinition did not eliminate ambition. It redirected it. The species aimed to become boring in the best sense, predictable, stable, reliable. These traits rarely feature in heroic narratives, but they sustain civilizations. Humanity learned to value them precisely because spectacle had proven dangerous. From orbit, Earth's activity leveled into rhythm, not stagnation. Pulse. Energy rose and fell seasonally, production matched renewal. Growth slowed but did not halt. The planet and its dominant species entered a negotiated equilibrium. The Anunnaki ceased active observation, not abruptly, but gradually. Attention faded as confidence replaced curiosity. Humanity no longer required evaluation. It had assumed full authorship of its fate. This release was irreversible. If humanity failed in the future, it would fail honestly. If it succeeded, it would succeed without inheritance. Either outcome belonged to it alone. The creators moved on. Not to new experiments, but to introspection. Their own history weighed heavier now. They had witnessed what they could not achieve. Creation had outpaced them morally. Humanity did not know this, and never needed to. Its journey continued without witnesses, without overseers, without architects. The silence above Earth was complete. Not empty. Complete. And in that completeness, humanity finally stood alone in the universe, not abandoned, not guided, but accountable, which had always been the final requirement. Accountability reshaped time itself. Humanity no longer experienced history as a straight line of conquest and collapse, but as layered memory, where past decisions echoed continuously into the present. This awareness slowed impulsive action and amplified caution. Choices were framed not by urgency alone, but by durability. Civilization entered what historians would later call a long stabilization. It was not dramatic. There were no singular turning points, no grand revolutions to celebrate. Instead, progress became incremental, sometimes frustratingly so. Systems were adjusted rather than overthrown. Policies revised rather than replaced. Humanity learned that endurance favored patience over spectacle. This patience altered innovation. In earlier eras, breakthroughs were celebrated for speed and scale. Now they were evaluated for reversibility. Technologies were designed to fail safely, to degrade gracefully rather than catastrophically. Humanity accepted that perfection was unattainable, but fragility was optional. The planet benefited. Atmospheric balance improved slowly. Oceans regained partial resilience. Forests returned where pressure eased. These recoveries were uneven and incomplete, but they reinforced a crucial lesson. Damage could be slowed, sometimes reversed, if addressed early. Earth was not forgiving, but it was responsive. Responsiveness became humanity's metric. The species developed global feedback systems not just to monitor environment, but behavior. Economic signals incorporated ecological cost. Social systems tracked well-being alongside productivity. These measurements were imperfect, contested, often politicized, but they existed. Existence became transparent. Transparency destabilized power structures built on obscurity. Corruption became harder to hide, abuse more visible, accountability spread horizontally rather than vertically. Authority relied increasingly on trust rather than coercion. This shift was uncomfortable. Humanity had long relied on strong figures, singular leaders, and simplified narratives. Now complexity refused to collapse into slogans. Solutions demanded nuance. Responsibility diffused across networks of decision-makers. Blame lost its clarity, yet this diffusion prevented collapse. No single failure could topple the system entirely. Redundancy absorbed shock. Diversity enabled adaptation. Humanity became less efficient in the short term, more resilient in the long. The Anunnaki would have recognized this as a strength they never cultivated. They had optimized for survival of their world through exploitation of another. Humanity optimized for coexistence within its own constraints. The contrast mattered. Exploration continued cautiously. Humanity's presence in space expanded gradually, not through conquest, but through collaboration. Habitats were designed to be self-limiting. Expansion was paced by sustainability rather than ambition. The species learned to treat space not as escape, but as extension of responsibility. This ethic permeated culture. Art shifted from glorifying domination to exploring interdependence. Literature focused on consequence rather than heroism. Music reflected continuity rather than conquest. These were subtle shifts, but they shaped collective identity. Humanity grew less obsessed with being remembered. Legacy transformed from monuments to maintenance. Success was defined by systems that did not require constant intervention. The most admired achievements were those that faded into normalcy, quietly sustaining life without fanfare. The universe remained silent. Humanity accepted this silence without resentment. The need for external validation diminished. The species understood that meaning did not require witnesses. Survival itself was sufficient purpose. This acceptance marked psychological adulthood. Species-level maturity does not eliminate conflict or suffering. It contextualizes them. Humanity continued to face disasters, disputes, and loss, but it no longer framed these as existential failures. They were challenges within a larger continuum. The old fear of abandonment dissolved. There was no one left to abandon humanity. That realization carried relief. Over generations, myths of creation lost emotional charge. Children learned them as stories, not truths. Humanity no longer needed to believe it was chosen or designed. It chose itself daily through action. The experiment's origin faded into irrelevance. What mattered was trajectory. From a cosmic perspective, Earth stabilized into a recognizable pattern. A planet with a dominant species actively regulating its impact. Rare, fragile, valuable. The Anunnaki, now distant both physically and psychologically, acknowledged something they had once denied. Creation was not about control, it was about release. They had failed to understand that until it was too late for themselves. Humanity, through error and restraint, had arrived there organically. The species no longer chased immortality. It pursued continuity. It accepted finitude as condition, not flaw. This acceptance grounded ambition rather than diminishing it. The future remained uncertain. Asteroid impacts, stellar events, unforeseen crises could still erase progress. Humanity understood this and prepared accordingly, not with panic, but with humility. Contingency planning replaced denial. The silence endured, not because the universe was indifferent, but because humanity no longer required conversation to exist meaningfully within it. The species had learned to listen to its own consequences. That listening sustained it. The experiment had ended long ago. What continued now was something entirely different. A civilization accountable not to gods, not to creators, but to time itself. And time, unlike gods, never negotiates. Time pressed forward without ceremony. Humanity learned that survival did not announce milestones or reward intention. It responded only to behavior sustained across generations. This realization stripped away lingering romanticism about destiny and replaced it with something quieter and harder to maintain: consistency. Civilization matured into maintenance. The most critical work became invisible. Infrastructure was designed to endure without constant attention. Systems monitored themselves, alerting humans only when thresholds approached. The goal was not dominance over complexity, but coexistence with it. Humanity accepted that perpetual vigilance was the price of longevity. This vigilance reshaped governance. Decision-making slowed deliberately. Rapid change was treated with suspicion unless justified by evidence and reversibility. Policies incorporated exit strategies. Every intervention required a plan for withdrawal. This discipline did not eliminate error, but it limited damage. Humanity learned to retreat. Retreat had once been equated with weakness. Now it was recognized as intelligence. When projects threatened ecological balance or social cohesion, they were paused or dismantled. The species became capable of undoing its own creations without framing it as failure. That capacity marked a turning point. Technology followed this ethic. Systems were modular, transparent, auditable. Black boxes became unacceptable. Humanity demanded understanding of the tools it depended on. This insistence slowed progress but prevented runaway outcomes. Artificial intelligence integrated under strict oversight, not centralized, not autonomous, but embedded within human accountability structures. Machines optimized within ethical constraints that were debated openly and revised collectively. Humanity refused to abdicate judgment entirely. This restraint differentiated it from its creators. The Anunnaki had trusted technology to compensate for behavioral limits. Humanity addressed behavior directly. It acknowledged cognitive bias, greed, fear, and tribalism as persistent forces requiring management rather than denial. Psychology became infrastructure. Education prioritized emotional regulation, critical thinking, and systems literacy. Children were taught not only facts, but how belief forms and how error persists. This was not indoctrination. It was inoculation against certainty. Certainty had proven lethal. The planet continued to recover unevenly. Some regions stabilized, others degraded beyond repair. Humanity accepted loss without resignation. Not everything could be saved. Grief became part of planning, not obstacle to it. This acceptance reduced panic. Panic had driven many past collapses. Humanity learned to operate under stress without reverting to domination or denial. Emergency protocols emphasized coordination rather than authority. Leadership rotated based on expertise, not status. Hierarchy softened. Influence flowed to those who demonstrated competence and transparency. Charisma lost power. Reliability gained it. The species shifted its values quietly but decisively. From orbit, Earth's patterns settled into complexity without chaos. Energy flows balanced. Population stabilized. Expansion slowed. Humanity reached a plateau not of stagnation, but of equilibrium. Growth became qualitative rather than quantitative. Culture reflected this shift. Stories focused on caretakers rather than conquerors. Heroes were those who prevented disasters no one noticed. Art celebrated interconnection rather than triumph. These narratives reinforced behavior without coercion. The universe remained silent. Humanity did not interpret this as neglect. It recognized silence as neutral. Meaning was no longer extracted from external response. It was generated internally. This internalization marked full independence. The question of origin lost urgency. Whether humanity had been designed, evolved, or both mattered less than how it chose to exist now. The species stopped searching for creators and focused on being creators responsibly. Creation took new forms. Humanity began restoring ecosystems not as preservation, but as collaboration. Species were reintroduced with humility. Genetic tools were used cautiously to repair damage rather than enhance dominance. The line between intervention and arrogance was debated constantly. Debate became strength. Disagreement did not imply fracture, it indicated engagement. Humanity learned to hold opposing views without immediate resolution, allowing evidence to accumulate over time. Time became ally. Long-term projects spanning centuries were initiated. Forests planted by those who would never walk beneath them. Infrastructure designed for descendants unknown. This future orientation stabilized behavior more effectively than any law. The Anunnaki, distant and disengaged, recognized a conclusion they had not planned. Humanity had surpassed the need for experiment, not by achieving perfection, but by embedding correction. The species had learned to listen to consequences and respond without external enforcement. This was the threshold. At this point, revelation would not elevate humanity. It would distract it. The Creator's story belonged to prehistory now, irrelevant to the present trajectory. Humanity stood alone, not isolated, but complete. Complete did not mean finished. The species remained vulnerable to cosmic events, internal failure, unforeseen disruption. But vulnerability was no longer denied. It was planned for. Humanity accepted that survival was provisional, not guaranteed. That acceptance grounded resilience. The silence above Earth persisted, indistinguishable from absence, indistinguishable from peace. Humanity no longer sought to fill it. The experiment's legacy dissolved into practice. What remained was a civilization capable of sustaining itself without permission, without myth, without oversight. Time continued, and humanity, finally aligned with it, continued too. Continuity revealed its final challenge not in survival, but in humility. Humanity had learned to endure, to stabilize, to repair damage before it cascaded into collapse. Yet endurance carried a subtle temptation, the belief that stability itself was achievement enough. Time tested that belief patiently, the way it always had. Generations passed who had never known existential crisis. They inherited functioning systems, predictable seasons, institutions designed to absorb shock. For them, catastrophe was historical abstraction rather than lived memory. This distance altered perception. Risk felt theoretical. Vigilance felt excessive. The discipline that had saved humanity risked eroding through comfort. The species confronted a familiar pattern. Stability breeds forgetfulness. Humanity responded not perfectly, but consciously. It institutionalized remembrance not as ritual, but as practice. Simulations recreated collapse scenarios. Education emphasized fragility alongside success. Children were taught not that the world was safe, but that it was maintained. Maintenance became identity. This identity rejected exceptionalism. Humanity no longer saw itself as pinnacle or anomaly. It framed itself as participant in a long continuum of life adapting to constraints. This framing reduced arrogance without diminishing ambition. Ambition transformed again. Rather than conquering environments, humanity sought to understand limits of coexistence across scales. Planetary management extended to stellar awareness. Monitoring of solar cycles, asteroid trajectories, and cosmic radiation became routine. Humanity accepted that some threats could not be prevented, only anticipated. Preparation replaced denial. This mindset extended inward as well. Social systems accounted for inequality proactively. Disparities were treated as destabilizing forces rather than moral footnotes. Perfect equity remained unattainable, but tolerable imbalance narrowed. The species learned that cohesion mattered more than efficiency. Cohesion preserved adaptability. Culture diversified without fragmenting. Differences were not erased, but contextualized within shared responsibility. Humanity maintained plurality without allowing it to fracture survival mechanisms. The universe remained indifferent. This indifference was no longer unsettling. Humanity understood that meaning did not require response. Existence was not a dialogue unless one was initiated. Silence was simply the default state of vast systems. Humanity embraced that default. Exploration continued with patience. Interstellar probes traveled slowly, carrying compressed archives of human thought, art, and science. These were not messages demanding reply. They were records of presence, acknowledgments that humanity existed without expectation of validation. The creators, long disengaged, no longer monitored. Their absence was complete. If traces of humanity reached other intelligences, contact would be between peers shaped by their own histories. No intermediaries, no architects, no inherited hierarchies. This prospect grounded humanity further. The species understood that if it met others, it would do so carrying full responsibility for its behavior. There would be no creators to blame, no myths to hide behind. Accountability extended beyond Earth. Humanity debated its right to alter other environments, even lifeless ones. The question was no longer capability, but restraint. Could humanity expand without repeating the logic that once threatened its own survival? The debate never concluded. It remained open by design. Open questions preserved caution. Closed answers invited hubris. This balance defined humanity's maturity more than any technological marker. The species accepted that some uncertainty was permanent, that not every risk could be calculated away. Time rewarded this acceptance. Civilization persisted through fluctuations, adapting without resetting. Local failures occurred, but systemic collapse did not. Humanity developed capacity for self-healing rather than denial. From a cosmic perspective, this was extraordinary. Not immortality, not perfection, persistence without domination. Humanity no longer framed its story as ascent or decline. It framed it as stewardship across uncertainty. This narrative aligned behavior more effectively than fear or ambition ever had. The experiment's shadow faded completely. No one spoke of creators. No one searched for origin with urgency. Humanity accepted that its beginning, however it occurred, did not dictate its destination. The species stood on its own terms. That independence was quiet. No banners marked it. No moment announced it. It emerged gradually, as all durable things do. Humanity continued not because it was destined to, but because it chose to maintain the conditions that allowed continuation. Choice, repeated across generations, solidified into culture. Time passed, stars shifted slowly, planets moved, humanity adapted. If the creators ever looked back, they would see a civilization no longer shaped by abandonment or control, but by learned responsibility. A species that had internalized the lesson they themselves had failed to learn in time. But there was no need for witnesses. Humanity did not require acknowledgement to persist. The silence above Earth remained unchanged. Below it, life continued, imperfect, vigilant, deliberate, not as an experiment, as a presence that had earned its place by enduring without permission. And in that endurance, humanity found its final proof, not of origin, but of authorship over its own future. Authorship carries no applause. Humanity discovered this in the quiet centuries that followed stabilization, when history no longer lurched between extremes, and progress no longer announced itself through catastrophe. The absence of drama unsettled some, comforted others. What endured was not triumph, but continuity sustained through deliberate care. Time revealed the final truth slowly. Civilizations do not end when they fail to expand. They end when they forget why they chose restraint. Humanity guarded against that forgetting by embedding reflection into routine. Not reverence for the past, but analysis. Every system carried memory of why it existed, what problem it solved, and what risks it posed if left unchecked. This memory acted as ballast. As humanity expanded cautiously beyond its home system, it did so without mythologizing destiny. Each new habitat was treated as fragile, provisional, dependent. No world was declared conquered. None was framed as replacement. Earth remained the reference point, the benchmark of coexistence learned through error. The species no longer believed in escape. Survival was not elsewhere. It was here, extended carefully outward without abandoning origin. This understanding prevented the old temptation to sacrifice one world for another. Humanity matured into a multi-generational mindset. Projects spanned centuries. Decisions were evaluated by descendants imagined, not present. This temporal humility stabilized ambition. It was no longer enough to succeed now. Success had to persist. The universe remained vast and largely silent. Humanity accepted that it might never encounter others, or that contact might occur long after current civilizations faded. This possibility no longer inspired urgency. Existence did not require audience. That acceptance freed creativity. Without pressure to impress gods, creators, or imagined observers, humanity explored for understanding rather than validation. Science pursued clarity, not dominance. Art explored meaning without propaganda. Culture diversified organically, unconcerned with universality. The old noise disappeared. Not because humanity grew quiet, but because it learned to listen. Signals sent into space were measured. Actions taken on Earth were deliberate. The species recognized that presence did not require constant assertion. From a distance, Earth appeared unremarkable, a stable biosphere, predictable rhythms, a civilization embedded rather than imposed. This ordinariness was the achievement. Ordinary meant survivable. The Anunnaki, long absent in action and thought, existed now only as hypothetical ancestors, if at all. Their story, if rediscovered in fragments or speculation, would hold no authority. Humanity's identity no longer hinged on origin. It hinged on practice. This practice was imperfect. Errors still occurred. Local collapses still happened. Species still vanished. Tragedy did not disappear. What changed was response. Humanity corrected faster, learned sooner, and resisted turning error into ideology. The future remained uncertain. Astrophysical events loomed beyond control. Internal fractures could still widen. No system guaranteed permanence. Humanity accepted this without despair. Impermanence did not negate meaning. It contextualized it. Meaning became continuous effort. Life persisted not because it was designed to, but because it was maintained. This maintenance was unglamorous, repetitive, and essential. Humanity embraced that truth. The experiment that had begun as desperation ended as responsibility. Not imposed, chosen. No creator returned to evaluate outcome. No final verdict was delivered. There was no moment of confirmation. The absence of judgment was the confirmation. Humanity existed on its own terms. If the universe held others watching silently, humanity no longer speculated about their intent. It focused on its own conduct, understanding that behavior was the only universal language that mattered. Time moved forward. Civilizations rose and fell within the larger continuity. Humanity adapted without resetting itself. Knowledge accumulated. Wisdom remained uneven, but present. The species endured not as singular empire or ideology, but as distributed, resilient presence. The silence above Earth remained, not as abandonment, not as test, as the natural state of a universe that neither demands nor grants permission. Below that silence, humanity continued, flawed, finite, accountable, no longer an experiment, no longer an inheritance, a civilization that survived not because it was created, but because it learned, slowly and repeatedly, how not to destroy the conditions that allowed it to exist. That was the ending no myth had promised, and the beginning no creator could control.